to another episode of Grow Beyond Grades, streaming live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and in the Grow Beyond Grades Facebook group. The goal of Grow Beyond Grades is to provide opportunities for educators to connect, share ideas, and support each other on the journey toward more effective and humane assessment practices, particularly those that provide viable alternatives to the culture of grading and testing in schools. If you're joining us live, we encourage you to engage in the conversation by sharing your questions and comments. Let's get started as we explore more ways to grow beyond grades.
All right, welcome to another episode of Grow Beyond Grades, the live stream. So you can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and streaming on our Facebook group. So I am your host, Dave Franjosa, joined by
Michelle Cottrell-Williams.
Okay, and so first we'd like to thank all of our sponsors, all of our Patreon members, and a special thanks goes out to Got Feedback. They have helped us produce this show. They've been a huge supporter of Grow Beyond Grades, and special thank you to them. So, Michelle, we have an absolutely fabulous guest tonight.
I heard.
Yes. So, this is somebody I have talked to in the past who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I think our audience is really going to resonate with her. So, Dr. Kelsie Reed. So, you're familiar with her, correct?
Yes, I have read her book, Hacking Deficit Thinking.
Yeah, it's fabulous read. So anybody who hasn't read that, I definitely suggest you go out and get it. I think it took me all of about a day to finish that. So I just couldn't put it down. Dr. Reed brings an interesting perspective to our conversations because she's a school psychologist. So, she's taking that approach to what impact our approaches to education have on students. So I'm not going to steal her thunder. I think we should bring her out and let her introduce herself and, what she's all about. All right.
All right.
Dr. Reed, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So just tell us a little bit about you, what led you to this line of work and, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I am a school psychologist, as mentioned, born and raised in Michigan, and did my graduate training at Loyola University, Chicago. And now I'm a practicing school psych in a school district in Maryland. I got to this work because I have always wanted to make a difference in the lives of children, specifically children who are the most marginalized by our educational settings. So growing up, I'm biracial, and I grew up in a predominantly or all Black household. And I always noticed the differences in how I was treated compared to my visibly Black siblings. And that's what kind of led me down this path of equity in education. So when it comes to the topic that we're talking about today, which is strength-based practices, all of that passion stems from my interest in disrupting inequities in education. And so I can talk a little bit more about kind of what that means and what that looks like. It kind of stems from this idea of deficit thinking. So deficit thinking, as my book was written, is called Hacking Deficit Thinking. But deficit thinking is when we hyper-focus on what's wrong with students, what's wrong with children. And in grad school, I noticed that that happens so often in our education spaces. And that is what kind of led me down this path of wanting to disrupt that by being strength-based. So, I think anyone who's listening, if you're an educator and you're in the schools, you know that we spend a lot of time focusing on what's wrong with children, what they're not doing correctly, areas that they need to improve on. And so I realized that when we do this, we really cause a lot of harm to students because we're not seeing them holistically. So it leads to us having maybe lower expectations for them, and it can just really, impact their outcomes, because it can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's kind of my passion work. As a school psych, I do, of course, special education evaluations, which, as you can imagine, are that's where like the most deficit-rooted conversations happen. So I think it's even more important for those of you in special education to adopt this approach.
So you hit on strength-based education and strength-based approaches, and so you mentioned deficit thinking. So what do you think are the root causes for why deficit thinking is so prevalent in our schools?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. I think that the first reason is that our schools were built with basically this idea that the students who are coming into our buildings are white, able-bodied, male, middle-class children, essentially. So we kind of operate from this lens of, we have this expectation of what the perfect child is supposed to be. We, a podcast is about assessments. We have standardized assessments that are tracking progress. We're constantly seeking, which students are not performing as expected, which students are not behaving as expected. But that as expected is rooted in bias. It's rooted in stereotypes that we have about what it means to be a good student. And so that leads to us, really hyper-focusing on students who don't fit that narrative. And that ends up being our students who unfortunately need the most support. So that would be the first piece, is it's just the broader societal, expectations of what education is. And then you add in, racism, sexism, all the things that we know are already just occurring in the broader world. But I would also say that there's a lot of pressure on educators, on teachers to, make sure that students have, that they perform well on tests, and there's pressure, and we don't get funding if we don't get X, Y, Z. So I think like that causes a lot of the deficit thinking as well, because there's pressure to make sure that students who are underperforming are, getting what they need. So what we're doing is we're pulling those students who are, have these quote unquote weaknesses, and we're like, you're struggling with reading, I'm going to make you read all day because you need to improve that reading. And that just kind of like, if you think about it, if you're being forced to do something all day that is already really challenging and hard for you, that just kind of like, for the child, makes school not a place that they want to be at. So it's just this whole kind of cycle. But I think it's rooted in a lot of, the purpose of education, or kind of how we deem that in our society.
And I think in your book, I think this is maybe one of the challenges we have in education, is we like to play nice. In your book, you went right after it, and
Yeah.
you went right after standardized testing.
Yeah.
And it was very well done. But it's rooted in eugenics. It's so when you talk about the racism, sexism, all of that, and standardized testing, that's by design. So and now we're held to a standard that was designed to alienate people. So anybody who wants to look into that further, just the opening of that book is tremendous. So they go right at it, and the argument is laid out very clearly, and it's easy to follow. So I do suggest, being that we are all impacted by standardized testing, at least understand where it came from. Highly recommend that. So, all right. I guess a misconception with strength-based approaches is that we never look at anything negative. So can you address that portion of strength-based approaches?
Yeah, this is like the main criticism, I guess, I get when it comes to this approach. And so I'll just start by saying that being strength-based is not about ignoring challenges. It's never been about ignoring challenges. It's simply seeing students for more than those challenges. So I think oftentimes when we have a student who is struggling for a certain reason, that area or reason for their struggle can become their whole identity. And we only see them for that struggle. We only see them for that challenge, especially for our students with IEPs. So what we're saying when we're talking about a strength-based approach is we are actively seeking to identify positive qualities, positive characteristics, strengths, personal interests, along with those areas of weakness. So for me as a school psychologist, it's, you know, when you think about when students come to me, it's usually because there is something wrong, right? There's an area of need, there's a challenge, there's behaviors, there's something that the student is struggling with. And so for me to adopt a strength-based approach, I'll just give an example. I think oftentimes when I would write a report, a traditional way of writing a report would be, you know, saying, describing this student, let's say Johnny, as I would say Johnny is a student who's struggling with reading. That might be like the main point of my report. But to be strength-based, I would describe Johnny as more than just his challenges with reading. So I may say Johnny is kind, he's enthusiastic, and he demonstrates strong comprehension skills when stories are read aloud to him. And then I go into his challenges with reading in areas where he does have support needs. So I think like that's where I get a little, I mean, I get it because when we say strength-based, you may think, you know, well, what about, you know, there are students who, you know, I hear this, don't have any strengths. And I really hate that one because, you know, every student has strengths. I think our problem is that in our classrooms and especially in school settings, when we think about strengths, we're thinking solely academic. So we're thinking reading, writing, and math. And that's not, you know, that's not all that a child encompasses. They're holistic. There's so many other, you know, character strengths, there's behavioral strengths, there's interest, even just things they enjoy doing. These are ways to just gain a better understanding of them holistically. And these things matter at school. I don't know how we came to this idea that, you know, reading, writing, and math is the only thing that's important to like look at, consider, you know, about a child. When we know, even us, like when we're working, we're way more than just our jobs, right? So I think like just kind of being intentional about looking at all of the things that make up a student's abilities is really important and can make a big difference.
In your book, you have a section, you know, where you're talking about your different kinds of reframes, and there's a page or two where you have reframed some adjectives about kids. I would love if you could share a couple of your favorites and maybe speak to how this reframe is not about basically what you said, kind of putting a spin on what is actually wrong with the child, and how this actually contributes to disrupting these barriers that you previously talked about.
Yeah. So my favorite reframe is reframing from attention seeking to connection seeking. And I like this reframe because I think that the number of students I hear called attention seekers in the classroom, it's like every student is seeking attention. That's always the function of the behavior that, you know, is identified. But when we call it that, it's kind of, it becomes a negative thing, right? Like, why would, you know, they're seeking attention and that's a bad thing. But when we call it connection seeking, first of all, it acknowledges that there is something we can do to support the child, which is give them connection, right? And it also reframes it from being a negative thing to a positive thing because, you know, connection is a strength. It's great to connect with people. And we don't want children to feel like their need for connection or, you know, attention is a bad thing. So not only does it like just change the way we talk about the child, you know, to make it kind of feel more positive, but it also really changes the way you interact with the child. So I think that's my favorite thing about those adjectives is like language is powerful. I always say it. And when you speak something, it becomes reality. So when you speak a more positive word about a child, even if it means the same thing, but it's saying it in a different light, you are more willing to support that child proactively. And so I think that that's just the power of making these reframes. And I do that in my reports. I do that during IEP meetings and consultations. If I hear, let's say, like a parent or a teacher call a child a word, I'll kind of reframe it like, oh yeah, okay, they're they're connection seeking. I get that. It's just a quick little way to just put a nugget into someone that like there's another way to talk about this thing that you're discussing.
Yeah, 100%. And that's something that I've noticed I've been very intentional about in the classroom. And when you talk differently, you then think differently about the student and then you treat them differently. And, we're so quick to try and remove emotion from the classroom because, I'm not a school psychologist. What do I know about, therapy or talking to them about their problems? I just want to teach science. I just want to teach math. Let's get to the curriculum. But, you know, uh, like Emotions Learning in the Brain, a fantastic book by Mary Helen Immordino Yang, where like you can't learn without emotion. So it's so connected that we need to find a way to bring that into our classroom in a positive way, and I mean, I'm with you. Our first job is making human beings who can interact with other human beings, and then if they learn something on top of that, that's gravy,
Yeah.
yeah. So like everything you're doing is just fantastic, and like I think it's so interesting to hear your perspective because you're coming from a student first perspective because you don't have to focus on curriculum. So you can focus on the student first, and then how can we address that student from their needs and then address the curriculum as well. Like, I mean, everything you're doing is fantastic, but, all right. So the reality is we work in systems that require us to do certain things. So from your perspective, right, what impact do you see traditional grading, or like the whole schooling process? What impact do you see that having on students' mental health?
Huge impact. I have an example that comes to mind actually. I was evaluating a student who had already been identified as having a learning disability. So I was going through my process, doing the assessments, talking with him, getting to know him, understanding his strengths, understanding his needs, all of those things. And he told me that he really enjoys soccer and he's really good at soccer. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. Are you on the soccer team? Because I know that there's a soccer team at the school. And he said, oh no, my grades aren't good enough for me to be on the team. And that turned me into crazy advocate lady that I turn into when I see, some type of injustice happening, especially for a student who has a disability. So this student really struggling to read, but like so motivated, so passionate, wants to learn. So I emailed the athletic director and was trying to seek clarity on, like, I understand the purpose of having, a GPA cutoff for, students participating in sports, but just offering a different lens that for some students, being on the sports team will be the only positive connection that they have to their schooling environment. And when we take away something that is going to cause a positive connection, the student's in middle school. He's got a long way to go until he's out of here. That leads to absolutely negative impacts on mental health, and a negative association with school. School becomes a place where everything I do is wrong. I don't know how to do anything. And it just makes it hard for, students to want to be there. So I know that's kind of like a very specific example, but all that to say, I think oftentimes when we view grades as the only marker of student success, we end up harming everyone. We end up harming a lot of, teachers view a student as incapable. Whereas if we give a student a different measure, they can still demonstrate that knowledge. And so why are they being penalized by, one specific, they have one factor that is, determining so many things for them. And I think it can put a lot of pressure on students. It can make students feel like they're, stupid. I hear that all the time. There's students I'm working with and they're like, well, my grades are bad, I'm just stupid. And it's like, no, your brain works differently. Because a lot of times the students I'm working with have disabilities. So I think especially for students who are struggling in some way, it can really lead to them viewing themselves as a failure. even if they're not, or, so yes, huge impact.
So just a follow up, and
Mhm.
I don't view it this way, but you will have people who say, well, isn't that just lowering the bar?
Mhm.
How do you respond?
Yeah. I say that it's not lowering the bar, we're changing the way we are measuring success. So I didn't finish the story of the student. What we ended up doing is we were able to modify his participation on the soccer team based on his IEP goals. So now we're looking at a metric that is individualized to him. We can actually see his growth over time, and we're not, focusing on an arbitrary number or letter, I guess. But I think I'm trying to think of another example. Like when we, for example, if there's a student who, let's say they're blind, and we're grading them based on we have to give them traditional standardized assessments to measure their ability to read, and they're blind, and we end up grading them based on the typical child who can see. So they're getting and this is an extreme example, but I think oftentimes we don't realize that like when students have an identified disability, there is a reason that they're struggling. It's not because they aren't trying hard enough. It's because the measure that we're using to assess them isn't fit to their needs. It isn't fit to actually identify how they're improving, how they're progressing, how they're performing. So I think, yeah, some people probably will, disagree with that. But I think that in order for us to actually truly capture how a student's success, we have to modify the way we do grading. A standardized approach just isn't working for a lot of students.
So to kind of piggyback on your example, like even if we just told students take off your glasses, that is an accommodation,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But everybody would say we're crazy. Like you
Yep,
can't do that,
exactly.
right?
Yep.
But though that's an easy accommodation for me. It's passive. I don't have to do anything as the educator. So where we get pushback or is when the accommodation causes the teacher or the educator to have to do something additional,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So if the accommodation isn't an additional burden to us, yeah, have at it, What you need glasses, go ahead. Hearing aid, I'd be cruel if I didn't let you wear
Yep.
that,
Yep.
So like, I mean, I've had students where I've had the sound wall where I wore the microphone, right? And
Mhm.
like, it's what you do. Like, that's what they need.
Mhm.
So, when you have students that have ADHD, that have dyslexia, you know, um, we should be providing supports, not because like, they need extra. It's because we're doing school in a way that doesn't fit the way their brain works,
Exactly.
right? And I think that comes back to that deficit mindset
Yep.
is, if they can't fit into this narrow way that I'm presenting information, there's something wrong with them that I need to adjust for, rather than us being proactive and saying, here's the way that we approach education. Access this information in whatever way best suits you and your needs.
Exactly.
Well, it makes me wonder too. So I was a high school teacher. And so I think about the students who have most often been seen through a deficit lens throughout their K-12 career. And I'm wondering about, you made a comment about it's not that they're not trying hard anymore. And I can imagine lots of high school teachers being able to say, well, like this one and this one and this one don't try. And it just listening and marinating in this makes me wonder in what ways a deficit model throughout their K-12 career actually contributed to, by the time they're in high school, you know what, I'm not trying
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that all the time, even in middle school. I always, when I do professional development, like trainings with my staff, we talk about, which students are you most concerned about? Where are the most challenging students? Let's identify those students. And then from there, the next question I often hear, oh yeah, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, all the deficit, words. But then when I ask, okay, well, where are they at academically? Are they able to read? Some of these just kind of basic questions, and they sometimes don't know, like they don't have an answer. So it's this assumption, oh, they're sitting in the back, they're just talking to their friends, they're not. And it's like, no, actually the content, what you're expecting them to do is way above their skill level. And that doesn't mean that we're lowering expectations. It doesn't mean that we're lowering the bar. We're doing them a disservice by having them sit there. And here we are assuming that they're choosing to not participate when really they need their accommodations, they need their services. They're not going to be able to get anything out of it unless they do. And you're right, to your point, if you go through your whole education experience not getting what you need, you start to internalize, okay, well, this isn't for me. I'm not good at this. So why do I care? Why am I going to try when no one's helping me? So a lot of times the kids I work with, they say that, like, I need help. I ask for help and I don't feel like I'm getting the help that I need. And so then I talk to the teachers and it's a different narrative of, well, they never do any work or they never ask for help. And it's like, okay, we need to all sit down and figure out how can we make sure that the student is getting the help that they need? Because if not, it turns into what you said. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
All right. So this is such a large topic and people can feel a little overwhelmed. Like, okay, how do I start? What's something that I can do with my students tomorrow? And I know it's not going to change everything, but what's going to get me on that path to where I can start moving towards strength-based approaches?
Yeah, I would say that I was going to say the easiest, it may not be the easiest thing, but the one thing that I would recommend is to start by simply going into the classroom with the intention that you are going to identify a strength from one of your most challenging students. So I'm basically challenging you to go into work tomorrow and that one student who has just been, I know we all have one, there's one student who's just been causing a lot of ruckus in the classroom. I want you to focus on identifying one strength within that child. I'm calling it strength spotting. So I think oftentimes when you have a challenging student, it turns into you kind of are only focusing on those negatives and those weaknesses. So you can do this by just simply observing. You can do this by actually having a conversation with them, asking them, hey, like, what do you think you're really good at? What's something that you think comes really naturally to you? What do you enjoy doing? Just kind of asking some questions like that and seeing if once you have a different understanding of that strength, how you can build on that in the classroom. So that's not necessarily what you can do tomorrow. That's, once you've identified kind of a positive quality within them, how can you build on that? How can you connect something to that strength? Or how can you use that strength to kind of chip away at the negative perception that you do currently have of them? So, and with that, even kind of reframing those adjectives, which we've talked a little bit about, how can you frame something that is, maybe perceived as a negative quality about them into something positive? So I hear defiance a lot. I hate calling students defiant. I think it's a really subjective word. But what is it about this student that makes you perceive them as defiant? And what's another way we can think about that? Do they have leadership potential? How can we transform this characteristic that we view as a negative quality into something positive that can contribute to the classroom? So a lot of students who are viewed, from a defiant lens usually are very outspoken. They're going to advocate for themselves. They're going to advocate for injustice. How can we teach them to use that quality that is a really huge strength in a way that is productive, in a way that isn't going to, lead to them continuing to be viewed from a deficit lens in future classrooms?
Yeah, and that's like in troublemakers, right? The canaries
Yep.
in the coal mine. And, we need to, rather than shutting those students down, they can help you realize here are the things that I could maybe do a little bit differently, not necessarily better, just differently. Because if you want to know how class is going, just listen to your students. They'll tell you, So, yeah. So now I know this isn't your area of expertise, right? So, but do you have any suggestions for assessment, right? Like how we can approach them. So I know you focus more on the standardized testing, but on a day-to-day assessment and interaction, what are maybe some things that we can do to have more positive interactions?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think would be a good addition is, along with your assessment, your test or whatever, have some type of question in there that simply just checks in with the student. How are you feeling about the content that we're discussing right now? And you can take that, just getting some feedback, I think can make a huge difference, because let's say a child bombs a quiz, but at the bottom they write, hey, I tried really hard, I just couldn't get it. It's like, okay, I have a different lens now. This student maybe is afraid to ask for more support, or, I wouldn't have known that they were struggling. So I think that would be my first piece. My second piece would be because I know I give different types of assessments, but when I do give my assessments, I try to find at least one thing that the student did well, one area where it's like, okay, they're grasping this, there's potential here. So I think finding ways to focus more on that potential rather than the grade. We're counting, okay, incorrect, correct, and we give, score, but it's like, okay, out of the ones that they got correct, or out of the ones where, there's something there, how can we build on that? How can we shine a light on that for the student? Acknowledge that, I noticed that, you're really good with this. I know you're having a harder time with this, but you have a great start because of your understanding of this. Like those words, they make such a huge difference, especially when kids get their test and they see those, poor grades or, whatever, just finding positives, shining light on those positives, making it clear that we see the student for more than those numbers, more than those grades, I think is huge. Even when I do my assessments, I talk to students about how they're doing, how they performed. And if it's something that they didn't do so well on, we talk about that. We talk about, maybe what is it that you need in the classroom? Or, what thing did you get and how can we strengthen that? So I think just more individualized conversations with students is huge.
All right. So we're kind of at the end of our time, and you have been an absolutely fabulous guest. And I would like people to be able to connect with you and your content. So where can they find your work? Where can they find you? How can they get in touch with you if they want to have further conversations?
Yeah, so I would say the easiest way to get in touch with me would be through Instagram at Dr. Kelsie Reed. I also have a business. It is called the Strength-Based Collective. So you can find us at strengthbasedcollective.com. And on Instagram, we are Be Strength Based. And on the Strength-Based Collective, I produce resources for parents, teachers, school psychologists to be strength-based in their work. So I have a ton of free tools that are all aimed at kind of reframing your thinking, reframing the way you go about working with youth to be more strength-based. So you can also email me through my Strength-Based Collective email, which is kelsie@strengthbasedcollective.com. Yeah, I would love if anyone wants to connect. I would love it.
And what's next for you?
Oh man, I actually have a lot of projects in the works. I know we talked a little bit about hacking deficit thinking. I do have more books, plural, in the works that will be coming out that are all for educators and or school psychologists. So I can't say more than that, but be on the lookout for that coming soon.
All right. Well, I can't wait to see what you have in the works for us. Very excited about that. And once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to thank our sponsors again, everybody who helps support us on Patreon. We try and bring free resources to as many people as possible, and your contributions really help us do that. And special thanks to Got Feedback, who has been fantastic in supporting us as well. So everybody, have a great night. You can find us the first Sunday of every month right here. Our next guest is going to be Angela Stockman. So looking forward to that one. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Grow Beyond Grades. You can find more great content on our website, growbeyondgrades.org, on Twitter at GBGEDU, or on Facebook at Grow Beyond Grades. If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting our efforts by becoming a member. Go to patreon.com/gradeless and choose your level of support. We hope you'll join us for the next installment of Grow Beyond Grades. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Grow Beyond Grades. You can find more great content on our website, growbeyondgrades.org, on Twitter at GBGEDU, or on Facebook at Grow Beyond Grades. If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting our efforts by becoming a member. Go to patreon.com/gradeless and choose your level of support. We hope you'll join us for the next installment of Grow Beyond Grades.